Hey there, folks. Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the #1 Joni Mitchell fan, here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Adrianne Lenker record, Bright Future. When discussing the most influential and noteworthy figures within the realm of modern folk music, Adrianne Lenker is surely one of the first names that deserves to be brought up. I mean, whether you prefer her work with her band Big Thief or you tend to lean more towards her more stripped back solo efforts, she is easily one of the most self-defined, one of the most impactful, and one of the most unique singer-songwriter types that's out there and active today. Not only have her best works been made up of some of the most sentimental and moving songwriting and performances that you can get from any folksy or folk adjacent artist in recent years, her extremely confidential style of lyricism is something that makes her extraordinarily unique, a nearly once in a lifetime talent in her best moments, to the degree that it feels like she's in an entirely different sphere away from the vast majority of her peers in the realm of singer-songwriter types, and even in a sphere away from a decent chunk of her influences as well. Am I saying that Adrianne Lenker is the greatest songwriter of all time, the greatest singer-songwriter performer of all time, the greatest vocalist of all time, the greatest anything of all time? No, absolutely not. However, she's a legend in the making, if not just a legend already, and I think that anyone who would be willing to deny that is either A, foolish, B, not in the know at all about the modern folk singer-songwriter scene, or C, just has some sort of hatred for Adrianne Lenker, I guess, because I really don't see how anyone could deny her status as one of the most iconic figures of the modern folk world. I digress. Bright Future, Adrianne Lenker's latest studio album, her latest solo studio album, is an album that manages to put together everything that makes her such an enchanting personality in the first place, while simultaneously featuring some of the best songwriting and some of the best production that we've ever seen her attached to. It really is amazing how she just continually seems to get better and better with every single project that she puts out, either on her own or with Big Thief. I mean, listen, as somebody that still genuinely thinks that Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Still Believe in You by Big Thief is one of the best albums throughout the entirety of 2022, I'm not afraid to say that I think this album might be a little bit better. Maybe just a bit. Bright Future is a record that, not unlike the vast majority of other releases that Adrianne Lenker has involved herself with in the past, largely defined by its songwriting, by its lyrical content. So if that's something that doesn't really appeal to you, if you don't want to get into a record knowing that you may mainly end up appreciating it for the lyrical content, this probably isn't the album for you. But if that doesn't sound like something that's appealing to you, then why are you watching a review on an Adrianne Lenker album? I review death metal and stuff too, go watch those. From the second that the record opens up with the track Real House, a very intimate and at times hard to swallow atmosphere and general experience for the listener is promised. The aforementioned track is Lenker's ode to her mother, with the song going through various different moments in her life, reflecting on her relationship with her mother, how she's viewed her mother over time, and the song ends with her discussing the memory of the family dog being put down, and Lenker seeing her mother cry for the very first time in her life, after the rest of the song built up this sort of godlike, invincible, sort of undefeatable image of her mother. And it's in this moment that you get this kind of feeling that it captures this breaking of childhood almost that is absolutely brutal in the context of that song. I mean, it's in those final moments where Lenker, as a child, in that final verse, sees her mother as human for the first time, as someone who feels, someone with flaws, etc., etc. Seeing a parent cry for the first time is such a definitive moment for a younger child, because you begin to recognize the humanity in your own parents, and thus the humanity in everyone, the fragility of human existence, of the human experience, it's just this really magical moment that feels every bit as stunning as it does utterly depressing, and I think that that's the intent. A track that's meant to be sort of moving in a way that feels both positive and negative, just very wistful and melancholy and reflective, while at the same time acknowledging the fact that there is humanity in her own mother, looking back on those moments and not necessarily seeing that moment as something that destroyed Lenker's world or anything like that, but rather something that just developed her worldview and made her maybe understand the human condition a bit better. The aforementioned track has some parallel imagery of the insertion of needles that I really like in particular, because there is a moment in that track where, in kind of developing the sort of invincible, almost godlike appearance that her mother has to her as a child, she talks about being comforted by her mother in the hospital, and the image of needles is being used there. Before the final verse of the song that really defines the entire track's purpose, you get the, again, family dog being put down via euthanasia, seeing the needle be inserted into the dog, etc. It's this really nice parallel that kind of shows just how great of a poet that Lenker can be within her own lyrical content, and it's one of several moments on this record that either made me tear up or just made me straight up cry when I heard them for the first time. This is a brutal record to sit through once, let alone multiple times when you're really sad, man. I'm not gonna lie. There are plenty of tracks here, in fact the entire album, really, that have some amazing songwriting on them. I just wanted to highlight the track Real House in particular because I feel like it's such a stunning way to open up the record. I think it's one of Lenker's best songs to date, and I think it features some of the most crushing storytelling that she's ever put to tape before, so I just really wanted to kind of hone in on that track in particular. The semi-duet Donut Seam sees Lenker partially share the mic with Nick Hakim, and it's a ballad of dying love that's emotionally draining in a way that is honestly hard to achieve naturally, that's hard to achieve in a sincere way, but that track feels entirely sincere. It feels like such a moving, stunning song. I mean, so few songs can properly manage to feel like the soundtrack to moving on, while also the soundtrack of just being desperate for things to be the way that they once were, and most of this record, but especially Donut Seam in particular, really do achieve that feeling in a way that feels so vulnerable, so emotionally intense, yet carefree at the same time. Just, again, as I stated before, very wistful, very reminiscent, very nostalgic at times, just a really well executed and emotionally striking album. When the duo partly harmonized for the final lyrics of Donut Seam, the lines, "Now our love is dying, don't it seem like a good time for kissing, one more kiss to last the years," before Lenker kind of trails off with the final words on her own with those aforementioned lyrics. It just conveys this mixture of emptiness as well as finality that's able to be found in those lines. It's really stunning, and it's incredible how she manages to convey this feeling of complete and total emotional coldness, while at the same time creating this imagery of warmth, of yearning for a time that has since come to pass, all the while feeling like she is moving on from these things, almost like it's a really intense therapy session that you happen to be listening in on, which admittedly for the listener can feel a bit uncomfortable at times, but again, that's kind of the point. Adrianne Lenker is surely making this album for herself, and the listener just has the privilege to listen in on it, and for what it's worth, I think it's a stunning album to listen in on. Elsewhere, when Lenker sings tracks like Evil, and you have lyrics like "You have my heart, I want it back," it feels like she's just kind of wringing her heart out in front of the listener, just being completely open and honest in a way that doesn't just feel like her rambling off her thoughts, almost more like a calculated way for her to be completely open with the listener, like she's planning out every single line in a way that feels genuine and honest towards her own mindset, while at the same time never feeling sloppy or thrown together. This isn't the deranged ramblings of someone that just needs to get a bunch of negative emotions out. This is not William S. Burroughs. This is a very well-made, well-structured record with some amazing melodies that also happens to be deeply personal and deeply troubling in some of the best ways at times. I don't necessarily mean troubling in the way of this being a negative experience. I just mean troubling in the way that this album conveys so many different emotions that one could potentially perceive as being negative in one way or another. A lot of very melancholic moments throughout this album that just feel so passionate, so genuine, so stunning. And I know that I've used words like, stunning and striking a lot throughout this review so far, and I'm not even done with this review yet, but it just feels right. It just feels like the most appropriate terms that one could use for a record that is so willing to just completely wear its heart on its sleeve and be 100% genuine with the listener. It feels completely honest lyrically. It never feels like corny or cheesy or like it's trying to be emotional or anything like that. It's just Lenker with her very natural poetic style, conveying her worldview, conveying her memories, and for that I will say I'm very grateful that she gave the music listening world the privilege to hear a lot of what she's saying and writing about on here. I also do think it's important to note that Bright Future's high quality, its high standards, aren't necessarily exclusively set by the songwriting. I mean, of course, the biggest selling point of an Adrianne Lenker record is the lyricism. In fact, if you go into her music not into lyricism at all, I don't think that you will nearly be able to appreciate what she's capable of doing artistically. And if you do listen to her music not really caring about her songwriting at all, then I would love to meet you. I'd really love to pick your brain about that. That is absolutely insane to me. Really, though, this record does feature a variety of instrumentals that are executed pretty perfectly overall, with a lot of the record coming across as intentionally sparse, which I think is something that perfectly suits the tone of the album, as well as Lenker's performance work throughout it. I especially love the re-recorded version here of Vampire Empire, which is originally a standalone single by Lenker's band, Big Thief, a very well-loved track by them, and a great track by them, to say the least. One of their best songs to date, arguably. However, I actually think I kind of like Lenker's solo version, her more acoustic version here, even more than the Big Thief version, which I didn't think I was going to say going into this. I thought that they would be equals at best, but no, I actually think I like the rawness of this one a bit more. I mean, the aforementioned track and its story of this very rough, undefined, definition-lacking situationship is perfect in the way that manages to be musically raw, with Lenker's voice still being smooth enough that it doesn't veer into the realm of harshness or anything like that per se, with all of the drama of the track really being exclusively a part of the lyrics in particular. And I think that the performance that she delivers here in terms of sheer emotion, in terms of sheer passion, kind of outclasses the version with Big Thief, with the original being very much focused on the full band context that the original is inherently placed in, with it being by Big Thief, the more lush instrumental and sound that is going on that track. I think that the sparse, the very limited instrumentation that's going on here, the very traditional folksy kind of instrumentation, I think it works best for Vampire Empire, and I think that it is maybe not necessarily the definitive version in terms of history. I think that it will pretty much always inarguably be true that the original studio version by Big Thief, their single, is the definitive version just because it is the original, it is the one that propelled that song to fame. But if you want to ask what I think the best version is, I kind of think this one. Cell Phone Says is even more up close and personal, with a lot of the great production choices being made on that track and various other tracks throughout this record, causing it to kind of feel like Lenker performing directly in front of the listener, almost like you're going to a solo acoustic show of hers and you end up being the only one there, so you just sit like 2 feet in front of her and listen to her play as she sort of pours her heart out to you through her songwriting. And while that may not be everybody's cup of tea, understandably, as some people can absolutely find some music to be too intimate, I personally adore it. The lush instrumentation throughout the track Sadness as a Gift is just one of the things that contributes to it being a major highlight throughout not only the record, but Lenker's entire career up to this point, easily being one of the best songs that she's ever written from a lyrical standpoint and from a melodic standpoint, as it deals with the notion of moving on from a relationship and the yearning for old times that comes with that moment in one's life. And I really love the way that she talks about having the hope that the person that she's leaving will write to her in the future, with the changing of lyrics throughout, saying that she knows that they'll write to her, and then that she bets that they'll write to her, and then she hopes that she'll be written to, etc., etc. I just really love how the song progressively becomes a little more confident in the lack of confidence that it eventually knows it should have, the lack of confidence in what comes in the future, the lack of certainty for what's next in life, so on and so forth. I love the way that her sureness of what the future looks like in that song progressively becomes a little more softened, maybe a little bit more fallen apart throughout as the lyrics progress. I just think that's a beautifully written track, and it really helps that some of the most beautiful instrumentation that we've ever gotten from a solo record of Lenker's is on Sadness as a Gift specifically. The more ballad-like piano work of the album closer, Ruined, is an especially nice way to sort of cap things off. I think that it's a pretty stunning way to wrap up the record. I think it's a pretty unique track in the concept of the record, too, which definitely helps in it feeling like a very final song in the context of the entire listening experience. And as the ambience of that song kind of comes to a close, and Lenker repeats the phrase, you come around, I'm ruined, for the final time after repeating it multiple times throughout the final moments of that song, there's this certain light that I feel kind of dims as things come to a close, as things, wrap up, as it comes to an end. And I don't necessarily think that light's a dying light per se, because I think that would imply that it's this really depressing finale or something like that. And I don't think it's depressing at all. In fact, I don't even think this record is inherently depressing. I just think that it's a very longing moment, the way this album closes out, and that's something that I think is valid to say about the entire album, too. It's a record that is longing. Now, the question is longing for what? And to that, I say a lot of things. Old relationships that didn't really go as well as was intended, childhood, innocence, etc., etc. A variety of things that made life better or simpler that aren't necessarily in one's life at a current point that you're currently dealing with moving on from. Those are the things that this album yearns for, and in turn it becomes a very melancholy record that nonetheless feels deeply relatable even when Lenker is talking about extremely personal topics that are pretty much exclusive to her own life experiences. And because of that, I have kind of end up falling in love with this record pretty deeply, actually. Do I think this is a perfect record? No, absolutely not. I don't think it has any flaws, per se, but this isn't one of my favorite albums of all time or anything like that, though it certainly is one of my favorite albums of the year so far. I just mean to say that I feel like the final moments of this record kind of sum up the entire record itself. It's this sort of recognition that maybe things aren't okay, or that things aren't going so great in one's life, or that there are some good things going on, but at the same time there's an equal amount or even maybe a lesser amount of things that were once good that are no longer there, and the sort of emptiness that comes with that feeling, that hole in your heart that comes with that feeling. And I think that it still manages to maintain enough hope to kind of feel like it's okay to move on from those things while also wishing that they were still there. Not necessarily anchoring yourself to those moments in your life that have now since come to pass, but rather just kind of becoming one with the present and looking back on the past fondly, or maybe even not so fondly, depending on the topic at hand. I think that kind of, at least for me, and in my own experience, my own interpretation, kind of sums up the record, and I think that it's just a beautiful album. So, yeah, Bright Future, absolutely stunning record. It's some of the best songwriting, some of the best vocal performances we ever got from Adrianne Lenker up to this point, some of the best production that we've ever found on a record. Not a moment does this album ever feel sterile or flat or anything like that. It just happens to be a very intimate album, and like I said, that won't appeal to everybody. Some people are going to not really like the whole intimacy thing. Some people can be made a little bit uncomfortable by that, and if that sounds like you don't like the sparseness, you don't like the intentional limitations of a lot of the instrumentation here, I would say, hey, maybe challenge yourself and still give this one a go, because I think that as long as you can appreciate good songwriting, in this case, great songwriting, this is a pretty easy album to love. Adrianne Lenker has always been a sincere yet poetic artist and writer and performer. Don't get me wrong, but I think that especially shines through here. She really is just a stunning lyricist on this album in particular, and I think that Bright Future manages to elevate a lot of the elements that made her older material so great in the first place. It's not like this album makes some of her older work retroactively bad or weaker or anything like that. I'm not going to go back to some of her older Big Thief work, some of her older solo work, and go, man, this is terrible compared to the recent stuff she put out. Bright Future's so much better than this. I just think that this is a pretty singular monolith in terms of her discography. Not to say that she couldn't follow this up with an album that's equal to it. I absolutely think she can. She's more than capable of that, and she's proven that in the past, but at the same time, I do feel that this record is this sort of giant representation of a specific point in maybe her life, and for some listeners, maybe even listeners such as myself, some individual listeners' lives that I feel is very easy to connect with, even in the moments where, like I said, she's talking about events that are exclusively her own life experience. Just a really stunning album overall. I don't have a lot to say about it other than that. I hate when albums make me emotional on this channel. It makes me sound unprofessional. You know, it often feels like Bright Future is an album that shouldn't be totally accessible to the listener, as if this is Adrianne Lenker just sort of pouring out the contents of her heart in a pretty private setting overall, a setting that should be exclusive to her. But with that being said, I feel grateful that we have the opportunity to hear what is arguably the single best thing that a legend in the making has put to tape to date. And yeah, I think that this verges on masterpiece territory, or at least individual masterpiece territory. Again, not saying this is the greatest album ever made or anything like that, but say 10 years from now, 15 years from now, if you walk up to me and said, hey, Bright Future by Adrianne Lenker, best singer-songwriter album of the 2020s. I guess I can't comment on that now because we still got a few years of that decade left, but as it stands in the present moment, I would probably believe that that would be the general critical reception towards this record, or at least I would hope that that is the general critical reception towards this record. I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.